What I'm here to really talk about is the work that's been done on exogenous ketones, past, present, and future. I think that there are a lot of situations where exogenous ketones will be beneficial. There'll be some where they won't be beneficial, and I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and so that's what this talk will mostly focus on. So I work as a practitioner as well as a research scientist, and when we think about athletic performance, we're not just thinking about the endpoint being athletic performance. We think about how this can be achieved through a variety of different means. And so some of this does relate to the actual ergogenic potential of a supplement or a diet, but there's a variety of other aspects to athletic performance that are influenced by nutrition. And so I'll try and give a flavour for where I think there are still opportunities for exogenous ketones in that context as well. And so you might ask how much improvement is worthwhile. Brianna touched on this already, I think. So if we're talking about something like the men's marathon, the Rio Olympics, and you pull up the finish times and look at the difference from first to the other positions, the difference between first and a medal position is a little over 1%. Now, in most research studies, we're thrilled if we see things like a 5% difference that's reliable to be measured, or a 10% difference, or maybe some are used to seeing, several fold changes in certain parameters. But in elite sport, the difference between winning and losing is very, very narrow. And so finding very small differences, like Brianna described in the cell metabolism paper, can prove very, very beneficial from a performance point of view. The other thing that I want to point out, just to give some context around the way we think about some of these challenges, is that there are many different types of athletes. And so we can look in terms of the phenotype, going from a sprinter to a bodybuilder to the other extreme, which would be a marathon or ultra endurance type runner. But the other important element when thinking about exogenous ketones is around the fueling and the energy systems that are used depending on the type of exercise challenge. So oftentimes, you're probably familiar with things in science. We tend to do this a lot. We study extremes. So we look at people like marathon runners and compare them to Olympic lifters, and we see very divergent energy systems, obviously, that they rely on. This can be in terms of the duration of the task, or of course, it could be whether there's a strong resistance or power component as opposed to aerobic component. I work predominantly in this space here, in the mixed sports, where you're dealing with athletes who do a mixture of intermittent type activities, low intensity activities interspersed with high intensity sprinting activities. And so the challenges in those type of domains are quite different to what you'd see on either end of on the continuum. So it's a mix of energy systems that we're thinking about. So just to frame this, within the working skeletal muscle, there are multiple energy systems that are at play here. And so there are the circulating substrates, such as glucose and free fatty acids. Within the muscle themselves, you've got the lipid pathway here, you've got glycolysis, and you've got the ATP phosphocreatine system, as it's called. Now, each one of these is active at all times. The relative contribution of each, though, is determined by a number of factors, the most important of which is the intensity at which the activity is being performed. But things like the individual's diet, their proportion of type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers, and a whole host of other things influence the energy systems at play. So, one thing that's important to realize is that the energy systems have different characteristics. The first would be what's known as their relative, the relative power here. So that refers to their ability to produce ATP, a rate of production, so the amount they can produce per second. And what you see here is that the phosphocreatine system and glycolysis produce ATP at very, very fast rates. It's one of the reasons why when rates of ATP demand are very high, as they are in high intensity exercise, where we tend to rely more heavily on these particular pathways. In the context of carbohydrate and fat as fuel sources, again, in terms of the relative production, you're looking at greater production in terms of, again, this rate in carbohydrate compared to fat. But this is something that's readily changed by adaptation to a higher fat diet. The other context, though, and I think Professor Noakes touched on this, is just that the capacity of fat oxidation to provide ATP in terms of overall amount of ATP is almost unlimited in some respects, whereas the ability of carbohydrate oxidation is really rather limited, and particularly phosphocreatine glycolysis can only produce enough ATP to power a few seconds worth of very high intensity exercise. So clearly, depending on the exercise challenge, and as I said, depending on the nutrition status and maybe the genetic background of the individual, this will again have dramatic effects on the fuel system being used. Now, it's classically understood, this is known as the crossover concept, with the idea that as you increase the intensity of exercise that you work at, that you're seeing a rise in the contribution of carbohydrate and a decline in the contribution of fat. And Professor Volek showed very nicely in the FASTER study that this particular line here is shifted dramatically to the right in the presence of a high-fat or ketogenic type diet. But as he did show as well, that even at the very, very highest intensity, so probably around 90% of VO2 max, even in these athletes who are very much fat adapted, there is still a reliance on carbohydrate at those very high intensities of exercise. So the other point I'll make is just in terms of sprint type activities. And so this is a classic study on sprint physiology, and it looks at the contribution of the energy systems depending on the duration of the sprint. So the reason that you're seeing this decline here is because the rate of ATP turnover declines as a sprint proceeds, basically as the person gets fatigued. So imagine if you were to try and run, let's say it's 400 meters as fast as you can, and where you go as hard as you can from the very start. You start off at a fast pace, but gradually get slower and slower until you complete the 400 meters. The point here, though, is if you look at the contribution of the different energy systems, phosphocreatine and glycolysis are making a very large contribution early in the sprint, like in the first 6 seconds. But as you go longer into the sprint, even though this is still a sprint type activity, there's a greater contribution from oxidative pathways. Again, my point here is that it really depends on the type of exercise challenge when we're talking about what energy system might be at play. The reason I think this is important is because a knowledge of the energy systems at play and knowledge of the contributors to fatigue in specific sporting contexts really influences what we do as performance nutritionists. So, for example, creatine supplementation has been shown to be very effective in explosive type activities and have next to almost no efficacy in endurance or marathon type activities, where you might get some of the buffers of metabolic acidosis, like sodium bicarbonate, tend to be useful in these might be called glycolytic activities, but typically you're talking about things that last less than 2 minutes at a very high intensity. Whereas you might get something like fat adaptation would be appropriate in these more endurance type sports, because that's obviously getting around the limitation that's present with carbohydrate. So I just want to make a point here that I found a lot of pushback already in relation to studying exogenous ketones, where people will dismiss the chances of us finding anything positive about exogenous ketones on the basis of 1 or 2 papers, which I'm going to tell you have been, in my mind, not really answering the questions that we want to answer. And so my point here is that 50 years ago there was this study that talked about carbohydrate loading and benefits to performance, but then 25 years later, they were still trying to study carbohydrate loading and what might be the optimal way to do that. And for us to have only been studying exogenous ketones for 2 years, and for people to decide, there's no point in studying them any longer, it's just a bizarre kind of pushback that we're doing in the scientific community. So you could make the same arguments about studying creatine, for example, like I said, studied early in relation to power, studied later in relation to endurance, and now being studied in the context of elderly and muscle health. So just to comment on, there's a lot to be learned, as you'll see in my last slide. So around about 2015, we were looking for a project for a PhD student, Mark Evans, who's sitting here in the audience, and a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about is his work. And I had heard on the grapevine this story about exogenous ketones and their potential use, and the patent was out at this time, and you could see that there was some positive results, as Brianna referred to in these rowers. And so this was early 2015, and we embarked on a project then to review what might be potentially there in the context of exogenous ketones, what had been previously published. Of course, it's worth pointing out that this is now 3 years later, and in this particular article, they described that 7 of the teams in the Tour de France were actively using exogenous ketones as a strategy within their race. So times change quickly. So our review really looked at the literature that would support the idea that ketone bodies are used during exercise. There's a response to training and the way that the body can use ketone bodies, and whether there was a physiological basis for exogenous supplementation. So this was published in late 2016 online, and it was 2017 issue of Journal of Physiology. So the information that we had to hand at that point was fairly limited, but in reality, it was in plain sight. There was a series of studies done in the 1980s that described the clearance rate of ketones depending on, and this was various durations of fasting, depending on the concentration within the blood. My point being that it was very clear that ketones were being used as a fuel during exercise. And then another paper was published where they infused a sodium acetoacetate tracer, and again showed that this could dramatically influence the metabolic response to exercise. But again, in particular, the ketones were readily oxidized as a fuel source in exercise and muscle. So, for reasons I can't get into, we in our review proposed that there was an optimum range for nutritional ketosis when it comes to sports performance. So we set that at somewhere between 1 and 3 millimolar, and of course the concentrations given by ketone ester ingestion were in that ballpark. Brianna, we were talking last night, she thinks it might be a little bit higher than 1 that would be important for performance, but it's in that ballpark anyway. We certainly need to get above 1, it might be closer to 2, but just keep that in mind when I show some of this data as we go through this. The other point to make about exogenous ketones is that the machinery within the muscle for the breakdown and the oxidation of ketones, whether exogenous or endogenous, each one of these, so whether it's transport or whether it's the process of oxidation, these are all enhanced by exercise training, at least in studies that have been done in rats. I'm not aware of one that's been done in humans, but in rats, it's clear that the muscle gets better at using ketones as fuel with exercise training. So Brianna's mentioned this study. The only thing I just want to point out again is just that the ketone levels in this particular situation were elevated above 2 millimolar. There was a dramatic effect on plasma lactate during steady state exercise, and also at the end of the 30-minute time trial that they performed. And again, just to show you the performance data, it was around about a 2% improvement, which, as Brianna said, was about 411 meters. They described it as. So. Dom D'Agostino and I wrote a perspective on this at the time that it was published, and we just illustrated some of the key pathways, which I'm just looking in the interest of time I can't get into. But I do want to highlight just one thing that we proposed at that time, that there might be a potential to affect things like decision-making, reaction time, and skill execution in sports people. And that'll be important when I tell you about a piece of work that we've just had published. So the first way we dipped our toe into this area was to look at racemic BHB salts. These were Ketocana was the product that we used. And so in this model, what we were looking at was elite cyclists, 19 of them, 12 men and 7 women. And we were looking at a water condition versus the ketone salt. And so I should say that what we had was a graded exercise challenge, 8 minutes per stage. We were trying to look at the metabolic response to exercise and whether that would be influenced by ketone salt ingestion. So what we see here, first of all, is that using, and this was double the recommended dose of exogenous of this particular product, and the levels didn't get up above 0.4 in that particular study. However, we did see a small effect on glucose, and that's been reliably demonstrated in numerous studies that one of the most, as I said, reliable actions of exogenous ketone ingestion is a slight lowering in plasma glucose. But we did not see anything at the level of lactate, which was seen in the Cox paper, and as I said, unsurprising because of the lack of a large increase in BHB. But we did see a change in the respiratory exchange ratio. The slight elevation in the RER there would indicate the ketones were being oxidized as a fuel in that particular study. So again, speaking to the point that they can be used as a fuel source. So there's been a series of studies that have come out since on beta-hydroxybutyrate salts, and each one of them has used a racemic form, so the DL form that Brianna referred to. This particular one showed no benefit in the context of a 4-minute all-out cycling bout. This one showed no performance benefit in around about a 10 or 12-minute cycling time trial. This one showed no benefit in a repeated sprint type of protocol done on a bike. Now, each one of these was done with, as I said, with the ketone or racemic ketone salt. None of them got levels above 1, as I said would be important. The second two here were done in recreationally active, so they probably didn't have the machinery necessary to really use exogenous ketones. And I'd say to date that people are very quick to dismiss the salts. I'd probably agree that they're unlikely to have effects unless they can be manufactured in a way that can get the BHB levels above 1. But to date, anyway, that's what we have. The other thing which Brianna just referred loosely to was the idea of this ketone diester study that was performed. And this failed, in fact, and showed a performance impairment. I just want to say a couple of things about that. The first was that this was an extremely well-conducted study in the sense of it had very strong ecological validity. It used caffeine gels, it used carbohydrate, and so on. It gets a bad rap because they use Diet Coke, but that's actually something that cyclists do. They just use flattened Diet Cokes, not fizzy. There was one fatal flaw in this particular study, though, and it is a very fatal flaw. But just to point out that they did elevate BHB, but again, only to levels similar to what we'd seen with salts. So this the acetoacetate diester is a completely different animal, of course, to the ketone monoester that was used in the Cox paper. However, even with that small amount, they did see this kind of similar trend as we did with the salts, where you see a small difference in blood glucose. They did see a difference in lactate, probably because the acetoacetate was elevated in this particular study, as you might expect, because of the diester, and because it was probably the ketone levels in total were a little bit, they were probably around 1 if you added them together. They showed a performance decrement. Every person got worse in the trial, but this is a quote directly from the manuscript. Each of the writers nominated their gut symptoms as a distraction or an interference to performance. Basically, everyone in the study had a sick stomach, and it's not surprising then the performance was impaired. The title is misleading, of course, because it neglected to mention that the main reason for impairment was because of the gastrointestinal upset, you would have to say. I just want to make another point. A lot of people are using handheld monitors. We don't use them because in our pilot work, what was very clear to us and what's been seen in cows, if you look up the literature, it's very well known that ketone meters overestimate. So blood measurements by finger prick sample overestimate what's truly in the plasma when you measure them by direct assay. And so, in fairness to the Leckie paper from Louise Burke's group, they showed this, although it was across 2 separate figures. This was the figure I showed you on the previous slide, measured with the ELISA-based kit. This is measured in finger prick samples, and you can see there these are levels getting up above 1, when in fact the serum BHB levels were below that, well below that. We did a study recently where we looked at intermittent running protocol. So this was a protocol that stimulated soccer. The way this protocol works is that you have 5 blocks of 15 minutes. There's intermittent activity. It's a mix of walking, running, jogging, and sprinting. You do about 9 sprints every 15 minutes. So we get a composite of sprint type activities, about 3-second sprints that are done each couple of minutes. And then at the end, there's a run to exhaustion, a short run to exhaustion, where they run at 95% of the max and 55% of the max intermittently until they fatigue. And so in this particular study, we used the KE4 ketone monoester from KetoneAid, and we were able to elevate blood ketone levels up to around 2 millimolar by the end of exercise. I won't get into this in too much detail in the interest of time, but just to say that we saw this reliable decrease in plasma lactate has been described when ketone levels are that high. What we saw was no impairment of performance in sprinting, even though that's usually speculated as a factor, and maybe we can discuss that in the roundtable. What we did see here, there was no performance benefit. In fact, if you look at Cohen's D here, this is a trend for a decrease in performance of about 12% in that particular run to exhaustion. So in this context of the study that we did and the protocol we used, we didn't see a benefit of exogenous ketones. There's probably a reason for this. Professor Volek has touched on this paper and the interpretation, so I'm not going to get into that. But what I will say is in a more high intensity, 150% of peak power output, that's like 1 minute all-out effort. There has been shown again to be a decrement in performance that's probably related to an inhibition of pyruvate dehydrogenase activity in this particular context. We don't know if this is what's going on in our model, but it is certainly true and well established even since the 1970s that BHB impairs pyruvate dehydrogenase activity, and so that could be a contributing factor in those very, very high intensity repeated sprint efforts. One thing, though, that was a positive and made a few headlines about our study was that we looked at cognitive function, and we were the first at this time to look at cognitive function in this manner. So we used 3 tests, but this is the one that showed significance. It's a test used by a company, it's Cantab, is the iPad-based cognitive testing. And so the way the test works is an arrow appears on the screen, and the person has to press, if it says direction at the top, they press the side of the iPad screen that the direction is pointing to. And if so that's correct. And if it says side, if the arrow is pointing to the right, they still have to point to the left. And so that's the scenario there. So what we saw was that the way this test battery works is 160 of these decisions made in 5 minutes. And the numbers here are quite small. They only made 2 mistakes at the start, but that declined, performance declined, and they made 4 on average in the placebo condition, which was carbohydrate only. But in the context of the post-exercise situation, when ketones were present in the feeding strategy, we didn't see a decline in cognitive performance. So, but just to say, there was no difference in reaction time or sustained attention, so this was a specific effect on this particular measure of cognitive function. We've ongoing work with human, where we're looking at 10K time trial in runners, so these are elite athletes. We're looking at 65% VO2 max preload for 60 minutes, and then a 10K time trial to test the performance effects. Just in the interest of time, I've got a couple of slides and then I'll wrap up. So we've been talking really about this particular aspect of exogenous ketones, the effect on performance. There's a major effect that I don't have time to go into now, just looking at the time here, but basically there's a whole other series of actions that beta-hydroxybutyrate can have in skeletal muscle, and these relate to the breakdown of protein, so that could have an influence on recovery and adaptation, also on the HDAC activity, which has been referred to, and influence on inflammation as well. So clearly there's a lot more work that we could do on the area of BHB and exogenous ketones when it comes to recovery and adaptation. So I don't have time to get into it, but just in the interests, just to summarize, there has been one study that showed a benefit in terms of recovery of muscle glycogen when a ketone ester drink has been used. There's been another one that didn't show a benefit, but the interesting thing about this particular one was that they did show that exogenous ketones were able to stimulate, this is in cells now, protein synthesis which would be an important marker in terms of recovery. And so this shouldn't be a surprise because this was demonstrated in the 80s anyway with infusion studies, so it's again been there in plain sight for some time. And one thing that we're interested in is the idea that if you look at markers like PGC1 that respond to exercise training, it's an influence of mitochondrial adaptation to exercise training. High intensity efforts are a strong signal to induce PGC1 transcription. And work we published from my PhD going back a few years now was that one of the key elements to the regulation of PGC1 was the inhibition of HDAC activity by high intensity exercise. And so I think it's interesting to think about the possibility that beta-hydroxybutyrate and the signaling through HDAC could be something that assists with training adaptations, particularly in low carbohydrate type scenarios. So I know I raced very, very quickly through all of that, but let me just summarize. So acute ingestion of exogenous ketones and the ketosis that ensues clearly has marked effects on metabolism in response to exercise, but to echo what Brianna said, not all exogenous ketones are created equal. Context is hugely important. The degree of ketosis, so how high do BHB levels get, and the method of measurement are key elements in any study. The training status or the fitness of the participant is going to influence how they can use it as a fuel source or as a fuel shift, you might say. And the nature of the exercise challenge. So very, very high intensity efforts might be unlikely to benefit, whereas more moderate endurance type exercise might be likely to benefit. There are potential mechanisms for enhanced performance that are established, some around the carbohydrate sparing idea, but there are also mechanisms that could impair performance. Can't dispute that. There are effects beyond direct performance benefits, so recovery and adaptation. I think these are probably the most exciting avenues for future research, something that we want to certainly do. And because small changes in performance, whether that's indirect or direct effects, whether it's physical or cognitive performance, because they make big differences to success for athletes, this is an area that needs an awful lot more work. The dose, the timing, and particularly the sporting context where exogenous ketones might be used needs an awful lot more work and needs to be optimized. So thanks for your attention, and just acknowledge the people that have worked on these projects. I have no funding or no disclosure side to report, and just we have funding from the Irish Research Council to do this work. So thanks very much.